Okay, so today we're gonna look at a pretty intense document. You've shared this chapter from Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, and it lays out this plan, kind of roadmap, they say, for a hypothetical conservative administration that would take over in 2025. And it focuses on totally revamping the Department of Homeland Security. We're talking about maybe even like dismantling it, totally restructuring, huge shifts in priorities.
Yeah, and it's pretty ambitious. It's not afraid to suggest some pretty radical changes. They actually go so far as to say get rid of DHS, start over.
Dismantle DHS, that's,
Right.
that's a big deal. Why would they even suggest that?
Well, their argument is that DHS, as it exists right now, it's just this giant bureaucratic mess. They say there's no cohesion between the agencies, that it's just expanded way beyond its original purpose. It's just too big, too unwieldy, and in the end, it's just not effective.
So if you're going to break up DHS, where do all the pieces go?
Well, they suggest this pretty dramatic reshuffling. Like, imagine a new cabinet-level agency focused only on border security and immigration. That would take over functions from a bunch of different departments, bring CBP, ICE, USCIS all together under one roof, even potentially take immigration courts from the DOJ and the Office of Refugee Resettlement from HHS.
So that would be a massive consolidation of power. What about
Yeah.
agencies like FEMA or the Coast Guard? Where would they end up?
So for FEMA, they have a couple of ideas. They suggest maybe moving it to the Department of the Interior, so aligning it more with like land management and natural disaster preparedness, or maybe to the Department of Transportation, potentially streamlining responses to disasters that involve infrastructure.
So it's about kind of like aligning agencies based on their core function.
Basically.
What about the Coast Guard? They have such a unique role.
Right. And they suggest maybe a couple options for them. One would be to put them under the Department of Justice, emphasizing their law enforcement role, particularly with drug interdiction and maritime security. Or another option would be to move them under the Department of Defense, especially during times of war, to kind of highlight their potential military contributions.
Wow. So they're really trying to reimagine the entire structure of Homeland Security. But I imagine dismantling DHS would be incredibly complex and probably super politically challenging. Do they have any alternative plan?
Yeah, they definitely acknowledge that. A complete overhaul might not be feasible right away. So they also offer a detailed plan for reforming existing agencies from within, focusing on streamlining, refocusing on core missions, and really putting a strong emphasis on border security and immigration enforcement.
So it's like a two-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Dismantle if you can, reform if you can't. What are some of the key changes they propose for like existing agencies like CBP and ICE?
So for CBP, they want them to be more data-driven and transparent. They suggest publishing more data on border security measures to give the public a clearer picture of what's happening. They also advocate for expanding the use of horseback patrols, which is interesting. It seems like a more traditional approach.
Horseback patrols.
Yeah.
Really? Is that an effective strategy in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's a good question. They seem to be advocating for like a blend of traditional methods and modern technology. They mention horseback patrols, but they also talk about leveraging technology. So it's not like an either-or thing.
Okay, and what about ICE? What kind of changes do they want to see for them?
With ICE, it seems like the focus is on really tightening their core mission of immigration and customs enforcement. They propose clarifying detention and bond policies, which would probably lead to a stricter approach to detaining people suspected of immigration violations.
This all seems like it would be a pretty significant shift
Yeah.
in how immigration's handled. What about agencies like FEMA and CISA? Do they get as much attention in this plan?
Yeah, they do. And the proposed changes kind of reflect this philosophy of streamlining government and potentially reducing its role. For FEMA, they suggest rebalancing the cost sharing for disaster relief. So encouraging more state and local preparedness, basically shifting away from federal reliance and towards more self-sufficiency at the state and local levels.
So less federal intervention and more responsibility for individual states.
Right.
That's a pretty big change from how disaster relief has usually been handled.
What about CISA? They've been pretty prominent lately, especially with the focus on cybersecurity.
Right, and the document proposes refocusing CISA more narrowly on its core mission of protecting government networks and critical infrastructure. They specifically say get rid of its involvement in countering misinformation, which they see as outside its scope.
It sounds like they want a much more streamlined and targeted approach to cybersecurity, focusing on protecting those essential systems. Now, we've talked about the what, the proposed changes, but what about the how? How do they think they can actually make all of this happen? Well, they lay out a three-pronged approach. They talk about using legislation, to make those big structural changes, like potentially restructuring DHS or reforming asylum laws. They also propose using regulations to tweak existing policies, like strengthening the public charge rule, which makes it harder for immigrants to get legal status if they might need public benefits.
So legislation for the big stuff, regulations for the details. What about executive action? Do they see a place for that?
Absolutely. They see executive orders as a way to make changes quickly, without waiting for Congress. For example, they propose using executive orders to reinstate Remain in Mexico, which required asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while their cases were processed in the U.S. They also want to restrict parole authority and prioritize detention for people who cross the border illegally.
So a multifaceted approach, using all the tools of government power
Yeah.
to make their vision a reality. It's clear they put a lot of thought into this. But Homeland Security, it's not just about DHS, right? There's a whole network of agencies and departments.
Yeah.
Do they address that bigger picture?
Yeah, they do. And they emphasize the need for better coordination and cooperation between DHS and other agencies like HHS, DOD, DOJ, and the State Department.
That makes sense. Homeland Security it's a web, not just one entity. What are some specific examples of interagency collaboration that they talk about?
Well, for example, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is currently part of HHS, they suggest moving it to DHS, or at least making sure its operations are aligned with DHS goals. They also talk about using resources from the Department of Defense, like troops or equipment, to support border security.
So finding new ways to use existing resources to achieve their goals. What other examples come to mind?
Well, they propose a pretty big shift in how immigration judges are perceived and treated. They argue that they should be seen as national security personnel, which suggests a more enforcement-oriented approach to immigration court.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. And what about the State Department? How do they fit into this vision?
They see the State Department as playing a key role in addressing the root causes of migration, especially from Central America, and in putting pressure on other countries to accept deportees. It's about tackling the issue on multiple fronts, domestically and internationally.
So this mandate for leadership chapter, it really lays out this comprehensive, and some might say radical, vision for the future of Homeland Security. It's a vision based on a specific set of priorities.
Yeah, and it raises a lot of questions, like what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of such a big restructuring? How would these changes impact the people working on the ground? And most importantly, how would it affect the lives of everyday Americans?
Those are definitely questions we'll keep exploring as we go deeper into this document. Stay with us.
So welcome back to our deep dive into this blueprint for reimagining Homeland Security. One thing that really jumps out is this idea of returning to basics.
Yeah, I noticed that too. They use that phrase a lot, especially when they're talking about what they see as mission creep and straying from the core values of DHS.
Right, it seems to be this call for a more streamlined and focused approach, prioritizing traditional methods and a clear sense of purpose. They actually specifically criticize what they call wokeness within the department, suggesting it's a distraction from its main mission.
That's a pretty loaded term. It's interesting that they use it without really defining what they mean by it. I wonder if it's tied to this broader conservative pushback against what they see as too much focus on diversity and inclusion.
That's a good point. And it's something we're seeing in a lot of different areas, not just Homeland Security. It raises questions about how to balance traditional values with changing social norms and the role of government in promoting social change.
For sure, it adds another layer of complexity to this
Right.
already complex issue. Okay, let's get back to some of the specific proposals. One that caught my eye was this idea of expanding the use of horseback patrols by the Border Patrol.
Yeah, that one stood out to me too. It seems to be part of this broader theme of going back to a more traditional approach to border security, even if it's mostly symbolic.
Yeah, it's like a throwback to a different time. But how effective are horseback patrols really? In a world of drones and sensors and all this advanced technology, it feels kind of like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
I think that's a fair point. The document doesn't really explain the reasoning behind this specific proposal, so it's hard to say how practical it would be. It's also worth noting that using horses in border enforcement has been controversial in the past. There have been accusations of excessive force against migrants.
Right. That adds another layer of complexity. It reminds us that even simple proposals can have unintended consequences and raise ethical questions.
Absolutely. It highlights the need for a careful and well-informed approach to any changes in border security.
Another proposal I was curious about was the idea of privatizing the TSA. That seems like a pretty radical move.
Privatization is often presented as a way to be more efficient and save money, but it's a complex issue with potential downsides.
Yeah, I can see both sides. On the one hand, private companies might be more adaptable and innovative. But then there are concerns about accountability and potential conflicts of interest. Would a private company put profit before security?
Those are good questions, and the document doesn't really address them. It just states the proposal. Without getting into the potential implications, it's worth noting that privatization has had mixed results in other areas of government, so it's not a guaranteed solution.
It's definitely something that would need a lot of thought and a careful analysis of the risks and benefits.
For sure.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about immigration. This document spends a lot of time on it.
Yeah, it's clearly a top priority for the authors. They lay out a vision for an immigration system that's much stricter and more focused on enforcement.
One of the main themes is this idea of closing loopholes and reining in what they see as executive overreach.
Right. They argue that the current system is too lenient and that past administrations have misused their power to essentially create amnesty programs through executive action.
They specifically target policies like remain in Mexico and the use of parole, which they see as ways to get around existing immigration laws.
Right. They want to make remain in Mexico into law, so it's harder for future administrations to reverse it. They also want to limit the use of parole, which is a way to temporarily allow certain immigrants into the country.
So it's about taking away some of the flexibility and establishing a more rigid system based on rules.
Exactly. They also want to limit prosecutorial discretion in immigration enforcement, which would mean immigration officials wouldn't be able to prioritize certain cases over others.
That's a big change. It would basically require a more aggressive and less flexible approach.
Right. And it's likely to be controversial. Some people would say it's necessary to restore order and enforce the law, while others might worry about human rights violations and the impact on vulnerable groups.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's tied up with political ideology and values.
Absolutely.
Now, beyond the specific proposals, I'm struck by the tone of this chapter.
Yes, it's definitely written from a specific point of view. There's a sense of urgency, even alarm, like the nation is under threat.
They use strong language,
Yeah.
talking about the border being overrun, and a government bureaucracy that's out of control.
It's a narrative that will probably resonate with some people, especially those who are already concerned about immigration and the size of government.
But it's important to remember that it's just one perspective.
Yeah.
And it's presented without much counterargument.
Exactly. It's important to be critical and consider other points of view. Welcome back to our look at this plan to change Homeland Security.
As we wrap up, I'm kind of curious about this idea of going back to basics that they keep talking about. What do they actually mean by basics when it comes to Homeland Security, and how do their ideas reflect that?
Well, they seem to define the basics as getting back to a clear mission for DHS. They argue that the department has kind of lost its way, moved away from its original purpose, and so they want to streamline things, cut out activities they see as unnecessary, and refocus on those core areas, like border security, immigration enforcement, and protecting critical infrastructure.
So it's like do less, but do it better.
Exactly. They argue that by going back to basics, DHS will be more efficient, more effective, and better able to actually protect the country.
It's interesting how this idea of returning to basics seems to appeal to a certain group of people. There's this kind of nostalgia for a simpler time, this feeling that things have gotten too complicated and bureaucratic.
And this document definitely taps into that. It offers this vision of a government that's more streamlined, more decisive, focused on results, and not bogged down in what they see as ideological stuff.
It's a powerful message, especially in times that feel uncertain and like things are changing really fast. People want stability. They want to feel like things are under control. And this document offers a way to achieve that, at least when it comes to Homeland Security.
Now, one of the more controversial parts of their plan is this idea of giving state and local law enforcement a bigger role in immigration.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a hot topic. They basically wanted to give local police the power to act as immigration agents.
It's been tried in some places, but the results have been mixed, and there have been accusations of racial profiling. Critics argue that it just makes immigrant communities more afraid and damages trust between the police and the people they're supposed to protect.
And there are also practical questions, like do local police departments even have the resources and training to do this effectively?
It's a really complex issue.
And it gets to the heart of this tension between federal and state authority, which is something that comes up a lot in this document. They also propose cutting off federal funding for sanctuary cities, places that don't fully cooperate with federal immigration enforcement.
That's another controversial idea. Supporters say it's necessary to make sure everyone is following the law, but opponents say it's basically punishing cities and hurting vulnerable communities.
It's a reminder that Homeland Security isn't just about policy, it's also about politics and the law and the relationship between people and their government.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about land borders, but what about the coasts? What do they have to say about the Coast Guard?
They want the Coast Guard to focus more on great power competition, especially with China.
So a more assertive role in a world where China is becoming more powerful.
Exactly. They argue that the Coast Guard needs to be ready to operate in more contested areas, like the Pacific.
It's a shift away from their traditional focus on things like law enforcement and search and rescue.
Right. They also suggest maybe scaling back their Arctic mission, saying that the Navy might be better suited for that.
So it's about prioritizing and focusing on what they see as the biggest threats.
And they definitely see China's Navy as a major challenge to the U.S.
It's interesting how they tie Homeland Security to these global issues.
It reminds us that Homeland Security isn't just about physical borders. It's also about protecting our interests in a world that's constantly changing.
Now, before we finish up, I want to go back to this idea of transparency and accountability. It comes up again and again in this document.
Yeah, they're really pushing for more transparency from DHS. They say the department is too secretive and needs to be more open about how it works, how it spends money, and how decisions are made.
And they want stricter accountability, too, like investigations into leaks
Yeah.
and getting rid of people who've done wrong.
This desire for transparency and accountability, you hear it from both sides of the political spectrum, but it's really front and center in this document.
It reflects this broader trend of people being skeptical of institutions and wanting more oversight.
It's about making sure that government agencies are doing their jobs properly, ethically, and in the public interest.
Well, this has been a really interesting look at one vision for the future of Homeland Security. It's based on a specific set of values that emphasize strength, order, and a smaller role for government.
It will definitely spark some debate as we figure out how to protect our country in a world that's changing so fast.
Whether you agree with everything in this document or not, it's clear that the conversation about Homeland Security is far from over. It's a constant process of figuring out what works, adapting to new challenges, and deciding what kind of future we want.
And it's a conversation that everyone needs to be a part of.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Homeland Security. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for more resources and links to learn more about what we talked about today.